So Bob, you just got back from Haiti, where you've been working with your charity, Lifeline Haiti, in the aftermath of January's earthquake. Tell us a little bit about the conditions that you encountered there.
I arrived about 2 weeks after the quake and still hadn't had word on our children and if they were all safe or weren't safe, and our staff. So we have 4,300 children and we have 300 staff down there. And when I arrived, I found that everyone was safe, which was a miracle. And but the area was like a war. It's like a bomb had exploded, and there was this massive damage, and houses collapsed, and businesses, and people walking around wounded and hungry, and it was quite overwhelming. If you weren't by an area that had been destroyed like that, and you weren't by a city that had been of tents, it seemed quite normal. But when you got into those areas, it was really hard. Yeah, it was a challenge every day, and that's what all of the organizations found. It was because there's the distances and it's mountainous, and there was a lot of damage in the mountains, and the roads were collapsed, and so one lane would only be open most of the time. And many trips back and forth into Port-au-Prince. So normally it would be about a 4-hour drive from Jacmel to the areas where we would have to go in Port-au-Prince. But some days it took 8 hours one way because there's so much traffic. And so the days when there wasn't any gasoline, it wasn't so bad, but the days where there's gasoline, it was really crowded.
Yeah. And then I understand that schools have been closed for the rest of the year. Is that right?
Well, that's what they've announced.
Okay.
I've had some conflicting reports. Then they announced that they'd like to open them by April. But see, part of Haiti, like the north part, got a shake or two, but that was it. So it's quite normal up there, except now that the people are moving out of Port-au-Prince into those areas, so it's creating some bottlenecks and some problems. But the schools, I think the best thing is to get the schools open, to get the children's mind back into studying and away from all the disaster and the death and everything.
Sure.
But in the south part where we are, right from Port-au-Prince down, right over to the Dominican border, they don't want to open. And now they're saying they don't want any of them to go into a cement school. And all of our buildings that we've built are cement. Only one received damage, the one in Deaconey. The rest are perfectly fine. We've had structural engineers come in from the Canadian military, and they've checked them out, and they're perfectly fine. But they're expecting another big one. They haven't announced it to the public there, but they're expecting another 8 to 10, and in the earthquake. And it's like all they're saying to the people is nobody stay inside. You can't sleep inside. So everybody's in tents or vehicles at nighttime, and no schools, no cement schools in the daytime, because they don't know when this could hit. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where I think it's really hard to predict. It might be something like California. They've been talking about this from California for years. It might be like that in Haiti for years and years. But the fear factor is huge. Like if you get a tremor, people just run. I mean, and it's not to me, the tremors are not bad. I've been to Mexico where the tremors are way stronger, and you just carry on because you're so used to them. But in Haiti, you get a bit of a tremor, and you just hear people screaming and running, and so they've been through a huge traumatic experience.
So how are your local staff people on the ground there who are Haitian, and your students, how are they coping with this incredible trauma that they've been through?
You know what? They've been through so much in their lifetime that they just seem to cope. It's the fear part is the hardest thing that they're experiencing right now, but no food or very little food is common. It's like the Prime Minister said to me, he said, well, Bob, are things getting to normal here? And my response was, and I knew what he was asking, and I wasn't trying to be smart about it, but my response was, sir, I hope we never get back to normal here. I said, normal here is 150,000 children dying every year of starvation. Right now, I don't know of any children dying of starvation. There's more food in the country from relief agencies. There's more doctors and free medicine than there's ever been in this country. So when it does go to normal, that's a day that I'm dreading, because normal here it was a catastrophe before the earthquake happened. And so now when relief agencies come in and they go into an area and they say everybody's starving, I go, yeah, that's the way it was before the earthquake. This is normal. And so that's the situation. And sometimes it gets overwhelming. Sometimes you just look at it and But I never ever feel to give up. It's the thought is, even if we can make a difference one child at a time, we'll just keep plugging, just keep going. Because if you look at the big picture and you look how impossible it seems, yeah, you might have a tendency of just throwing up your hands and pulling out. But that's not an option as far as I'm concerned. But the people, they're my heroes. I couldn't imagine us in North America going through what they're going through. But they somehow survive. They're I don't know, they're so used to trauma, they're so used to death, and somehow they manage. And like in most areas, it looks normal. They've got fruit stands up and they're selling things, and they're working and they're making clothes and selling clothes, and in a lot of areas it looks quite normal. But in the big picture of the amount of people that are still injured, the amount of people that had amputations, the care that's needed long term for a lot of these people is still huge. Probably the hardest workers I saw there were the doctors and nurses, the ones especially with the Doctors Without Borders. I mean, some of the surgeons I met were doing 10, 12, 14 surgeries a day. We're totally exhausted, but worked and worked and worked, and there was so much we couldn't do. We couldn't because we had no fuel, because we didn't have vehicles, but we're seeing progress now.
From your perspective, what needs to be done for the country to recover, or what can the rest of the world do? What can Haiti do?
Well, first of all, a building code would be huge, but the problem with a building code is it increases the cost to build and they don't have money. And so that would be a start. Some of the problems that I have seen in the construction side of it is they use a white sand in the rebar, and this is what they've done years ago. And the white sand has a salt in it and it eats away the rebar. What you have to do is put a black sand on your rebar, and then the black sand doesn't bother, and you build your bricks or your cinder blocks with the white sand. But build them so that you do maybe 30 bricks per bag of cement rather than 120. So instead of having a sand castle, you get something solid. But what has happened is the white sand has eaten off a lot of the steel in this rebar, and it's become very weak. So when you get a shaker like this happen, everything just collapses, and that's a big part of what the problem is. And then just to build the country up by, like what we do is microloans. So far we've got 63 businesses up and going with microloans. But business will get them, and education will help. So the combination of education, small business, training in technical schools, teaching them welding, electrical, and that's something else we're working on. We've started the construction of our cinder block plant, which was in the plans before this happened, but now is more of a priority because there's a need for millions and millions of cinder blocks, especially well-built ones, which we hope to be doing within the next couple of months. And then this will be something that will help generate funds for the schools so we can reopen the schools.
That's interesting. And right now they're serving as feeding centers in the schools, is that right?
No, they're using temporary tent facilities. They won't go anywhere near the cement. Yeah.
Right.
And they just stay away from the cement buildings. And even though there's not a crack in them, they're really strong. But it's just a psychological thing for a while, and hopefully within a year or two they'll get over it, and hopefully within a year or two we can go back to cement buildings. But if not, what we're doing for temporary buildings is tarps and 2x4s, maybe even tents. We could put up a tent in Jackmel that would hold 2,000 people, for example, and we could accommodate 600 in a school there, whereas our existing school is packed out at 220. So. And a good tent like that would last 10, 15 years, so that's an option.
So you talked a little bit about a lot of the future plans for your organization, but kind of what's the next immediate priority for Lifeline Haiti?
To make sure everybody's got shelter. The food part we have in place now, and we've got more food coming in from Medicine Hat here from Gleaners, but is getting them into some kind of shelter. When the schools open, whenever that is, to make sure that they're safe for the children. And the feeding program, we don't want to ever stop the feeding program. As a matter of fact, we want to expand it to all the children that are waiting. So we have 12,000 with the ones that are in school and the ones that are waiting. We hope to now be able to feed 12,000 every day. And we may not be able to open the school, we may not have the money to pay teachers yet and that type of thing, but at least if they're getting fed, they'll be still alive by the time we do get a chance to open the school, whether it's 2 or 3 years down the road or 5 or 6 years down the road.